One of the most captivating moments in history are the myths. What better way to start than with the landscape of ancient Egypt? Spaceships from Alpha Centauri that built the pyramids, slaves toiling to death, the curse of the pharaohs and the deadly traps in the pharaohs' tombs, and many other myths about the beautiful ancient country. And in the next few minutes we'll be clearing them up, so sit back and write in the comments what other myths you'd like to hear in the next few episodes. We'll probably start with the most important one, namely the Indiana Jones movie and the Lara Croft places that firmly beat us to the Egyptian pyramids being catacombs full of traps, hidden doors, scorpions and poisonous spears. This myth doesn't stand up to any reality check. Of all the archaeological finds, only a few tombs were protected. But even today archaeologists are still arguing about whether those collapsed bridges were a coincidence, because how could they not be, but the graves are thousands of years old. In reality, the only thing the Egyptians can be blamed for is the complex internal structure of the pyramids, and that most of the tombs really are full of detours. Thus it is extremely difficult to get from the outside to the sarcophagus without knowing the construction plan. Yet this was done for a reason unrelated to security. The thing is in the religion of the Egyptians simply protected the tomb from contact with the outside world and protected the peace of the pharaoh. That's why the entrance to the tomb from the outside was always covered with huge stones, because in ancient Egypt they believed that the deceased actually lived in the afterlife and moved through the pyramid and even went out into the world of the living. It would be silly to mine the entrance-exit route in the pyramid for your own pharaoh. The only real part of the security system is the fake burial chambers. They were disguised as already being robbed, so that a thief who had already entered would think the pyramid had already been robbed by someone. Most of the time the pyramid builders themselves were responsible for the thefts. Knowing the real plan of the pyramid construction, it was not difficult for them to break into the pyramid and rob it after some time. For their part, it would still be foolish to complicate their work with traps during construction. From other parts that are associated with this myth, we note that crossbows at that time in ancient Egypt did not exist, and that all the arrow-shooting walls in films are obviously a myth, as is the appearance of scarabs that featured in every project about the pharaohs. In ancient Egypt, the scarab beetle was considered holy. It symbolizes life after death and resurrection. It is associated with the sun. The scarab god Hepri, according to Egyptian conceptions, rolled the sun in the sky like his earthly counterparts rolled manure balls. Let's go ahead and talk about hieroglyphs. The most important thing to remember is that the language of the ancient Egyptians simply doesn't exist. Hieroglyphs are not a lie. It's about the fact that they were used in Egypt from the 4th millennium BC to the 4th century AD. That's at least 3,500 years of history. Read a text that's a few hundred years old and you'll understand what we're talking about, and if you still don't get it, it's about the fact that over such a long time any language changes hundreds of times. And in general it is not clear which version is thus considered the ancient Egyptian language. The Latin language, for example, has sometimes a dozen different varieties, sometimes completely different from each other. Likewise, the hieroglyphs of different eras of ancient Egypt could have completely different meanings. Even optimistic Egyptologists point to as many as 4 varieties of language. How that language sounds to us is a mystery. Today there are about 1,000 speakers of the Coptic language, which is considered the direct successor of the language of ancient Egypt. We here want to note that even the hieroglyphs are not as simple as they seem at first glance. Most people think of hieroglyphs as designating words, like if the Egyptian wanted to write about a house he drew a house, or if he wanted to say someone was smart he drew a crow. In reality it is not so clear here. Some words in ancient Egypt were indeed represented by hieroglyphs, but some hieroglyphs represented phonograms denoting a certain sound. This is what we found out with the Rosetta Stone, with the same inscription in ancient Egyptian and ancient Greek. There it was shown that most of the hieroglyphs on the stone turned out to be sounds. But we're going to talk about a slightly more elegant myth. Now in every second source you can find out that the Egyptians smoked and drank alcoholic beverages in abundance. In 1976, botanist Michel Lescot supposedly discovered traces of nicotine in the abdominal cavity of Ramses II, later found in other parts of the pharaoh's body. The hoax went even further, that a whole packet of so-called cocaine mummies was found in the remains of the priestess Hen-Nutawi. The problem is that neither tobacco nor cocaine in the ancient world before the discovery of America were, that cocaine bushes or tobacco plants only grew there. Of course, the popular TV channels have posted plenty of documentaries about the drug trade in ancient times and that the ancient Egyptians discovered America. Actually, in this case, nicotine in mummies is quite understandable. Ginseng and stinking celery were used for embalming. Both plants contain nicotine in quite small amounts. The only thing right about this myth is that the Egyptians did indeed consume alcoholic beverages. Water at high temperatures disappears and can cause health problems, which is why the Egyptians drank beer even while working on those pyramids. In one of the tombs, as if preserved yeast was found, from which they would have made drink according to the ancient recipe. Another way to escalate the situation around ancient Egypt is the human sacrifices that were made to the gods. Every second subconscious believes that the pharaoh was buried along with all his workers and hundreds more slaves. These conclusions have been made from early archaeological discoveries. For example, even on Wikipedia you can read that during the burial of Pharaoh Den as an offering 136 men were brought as sacrifices. The tomb of the real pharaoh was unearthed and studied by archaeologists, and it was decided the number of people buried nearby. Even priests or minor officials who were subordinate to the ruler were identified. Only there is no inscription to prove that this was a sacrifice. It was assumed so on the basis of an excavated grave, where indeed bones with fractures or skeletons without skulls were found. There is only one problem: the case was 5,000 years ago. In that time Pharaoh Den's tomb was plundered by dozens of generations of warriors. We cannot be sure that the warriors did not influence the condition of these skeletons while looting them. And it's pretty logical that they needed the bracelets and jewelry of the buried. There are only a few cases where people were definitely forcibly killed. And even then we're talking about a very long dynastic period and the First Dynasty period. From an archaeological point of view here, it is more correct to say that sacrifices were only in a rather limited format at the beginning of the development of ancient Egypt. In the future there is no reliable evidence of such rituals, and even more so there is no evidence that everyone close to the pharaoh was buried alive with him. It is more likely that officials and priests died their natural deaths only to be buried with their ruler. This ruler looks a far cry from what Hollywood draws. Studying pharaoh mummies, scientists have concluded that more than half of all pharaohs suffered from obesity problems. For example, the legendary Hatshepsut, claiming to the name of one of the most influential women in history, died at the age of 50 suffering from obesity, baldness and diabetes. Of the similarities in the film, only the black and red Gothic makeup is similar. In defense of ancient Egypt, we note that physicians of those times knew of diabetes, even more tried to cure it. That is to say, we cannot say that the pharaohs were not warned about the danger of eating food. Only that could not stop them from not consuming meat, wine, beer, bread and honey. Together with the terrible genetics of the pharaohs, who were often children of incest, was getting a fatal scenario for most. The archaeologists who disturbed the pharaoh's sleep died. After the excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb in November 1922, dozens of archaeologists died, one after the other. And so the curse of the pyramids began, enriching the creators of films and games. The irony is in the fact that in ancient Egypt they didn't even have the concept of a curse. It came much later. Thieves were often frightened by the inscriptions on the walls. And yet why did the expedition members die? You won't believe it, they died of old age. The average life expectancy of members of the Howard Carter expedition that opened Tutankhamun's tomb was 75 years. Carter himself died at the age of 69 from simple lymphoma. Moreover, this happened in 1939, 17 years after the opening of the pyramid. In general, the pharaoh curse theory does not stand up to criticism. And finally, we will talk about the pyramids and their construction. All archaeological findings show us that the pyramids were not built by slaves. The closest analogy is the global construction in the Soviet Union, where people from all over the country gathered to build. Current research points to the fact that in ancient Egypt people went to work building pyramids as paid and quite respected work, and if the payment was not there, the workers could go on strike. For example, so did the painters who drew the tombs during the rule of Pharaoh Ramses III. This strike is considered to be the oldest in history. Besides, there is evidence in the form of expensive tombs for the workers. Simply put, this was so long ago that to find out the details is virtually impossible, thus giving rise to myths at every turn about ancient Egypt. About what is more important we have discussed. If this discussion will be on the soul, we will be glad and appreciation and comments on the topic. See you soon, friends.